Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I pull back the curtain on last year's Democratic National Convention, which had a wildly fraudulent video about climate. The video said that fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, everything bad in the world was getting worse because of global warming, and was Donald Trump's fault. It also said that we could fix all of these by building windmills and solar panels. But before I jump into showing you what a bunch of total nonsense the Democrats' claims are, let's watch the video.
We all know it's happening. It's real. It's happening now. The droughts, the storms, the floods, the fires, the record heat waves. This is not something we've seen before.
Very dramatic, Sigourney, and I loved how you finished it.
This is not something we've seen before.
Well, actually, it is something we've seen before. In fact, we've seen it lots of times before. And in the 1970s, they blamed it all on global cooling, not global warming. This article is from July 14, 1974. Global climate believed returning to harsher state. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world has dropped by 1/3 to 1/2 degrees centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperatures since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Great Britain. The Sigourney Weaver video reminded me of something. With all its flashing lights, noise, and scary effects, it reminded me of this scene from The Wizard of Oz.
Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
If you are really great and powerful, you'll keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz, you ungrateful creatures?
Well, it's time for Toto to pull back the curtain on junk science one more time. Let's see if there's any truth to Sigourney Weaver's dramatics. She said that droughts are getting worse. But the data shows the exact opposite. In this graph from NOAA, brown represents droughts and green represents wet periods. Well, back when Toto was pulling back the curtain in the 1930s, the U.S. was in a terrible drought. Remember how dry Annie M's farm was before the tornado blew in? There was dust everywhere. That's why they called it the Dust Bowl. Since the 1930s, droughts have become much less common and much less severe in the United States. The United States has gotten much wetter. We don't have widespread droughts anymore like we did in the 1930s and the 1950s. Sigourney Weaver's claim was patently false. And then she went on to another segment where they were talking to a farmer in Texas who said all of his cattle were dying from the drought. But Texas was in the middle of their second wettest period on record last year during the DNC. What on earth was Sigourney talking about? Well, she was talking about a drought from 5 years earlier in 2011, back in the days when Democrats were still able to win an election. Her story about drought was complete nonsense. What about her claim of unprecedented fires? According to the U.S. Forest Service, burn acreage in the United States is down about 80% since the 1930s. Here's an article from my favorite newspaper, the New York Times, from 1938. Forest fires, one every 3 minutes in 1937, burned almost 22 million acres. Well, that's a lot more burn acreage than we get now. Now we get less than 10 million acres. America's worst fires actually occurred in 1871. On October 8, 1871, the same day which Chicago burned to the ground, forest fires appeared all around Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Dozens of cities were destroyed, and more than 1,000 people were burned alive. The character of the fire was unlike any described before. It was a flame fanned by a hurricane and accompanied with various electrical sparks. Over 1,500 men, women, and children have been burned to death in Wisconsin alone. Their houses and farms are to a large extent utterly destroyed, the very soil having burned up. The loss of life in northern Wisconsin is more than 5 times greater than that of Chicago. The town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin has been entirely destroyed, and upwards of 400 dead bodies have been recovered, and it's thought that 300 more are in the river. The velocity of the fire was so great that all escape was impossible. Many people jumped into water wells to try to save their lives, and they ended up being boiled alive. As bad as the 1871 fires were, they weren't America's largest fires. Those occurred in 1910. There's a lot of hysteria in the press about an upcoming heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, but during 1910, it was hot and dry all summer. By the third week of August in 1910, massive forest fires were burning all over Idaho, Montana, and Washington. More than 1,700 fires burned in the Pacific Northwest that summer, and they burned up more than 3 million acres. So when Sigourney Weaver said we've never seen fires like this before, that's simply not true. We've had much worse fires in the past. I think it's incredibly unpatriotic to try to erase essential parts of American history. But then I'm not a Democrat. So what about Sigourney Weaver's claims about hurricanes? This data is taken from NOAA and shows the average number of U.S. hurricane strikes per year for each president going back to 1850. U.S. hurricane strikes peaked in the 1880s when Grover Cleveland was president, and they've declined ever since. One exception was while George Bush was president in 2005, we had a lot of hurricanes, which climate experts immediately declared to be the new normal. But while Barack Obama was president, the U.S. had the lowest hurricane frequency on record, averaging just about 1/2 hurricane per year, compared to more than 3 hurricanes per year while Grover Cleveland was president. U.S. hurricane strikes are down 80% since the 1880s. When Sigourney Weaver said we've never seen hurricanes like this before, she was simply not telling the truth. A single hurricane in the year 1900 destroyed Galveston, Texas, and killed 10,000 people. In 1926, Miami was destroyed by a hurricane, which brought 10 feet of water to the downtown area. The entire city was destroyed. It was America's costliest natural disaster. This article from the Palm Beach Post listed some of America's deadliest hurricanes. In 1915, a September hurricane with winds of 105 miles per hour pushed up a storm surge that destroyed 95% of the buildings on the Louisiana coast south of New Orleans. Deaths 275. 1919, an early September hurricane caused more than 500 casualties at sea. It lashed the Florida Keys with 110 mile per hour winds. Florida deaths 300, damage 2 million. In 1921, an October hurricane with winds of 100 miles per hour killed 6 persons in Tampa Bay. The list goes on and continues to the next page. The United States has had lots of very bad hurricanes, and we've actually been in the quietest period on record for hurricanes over the last decade. The last time the U.S. was hit by a major hurricane, which is defined as having winds more than 120 miles per hour, was in the year 2005. The last 12 years have been the quietest on record in the United States for major hurricanes. And 2005 was also the last time Florida was hit by a hurricane. This is by far the longest period which Florida has gone without a hurricane. For the entire Atlantic, 3 of the 10 deadliest hurricanes occurred between 1775 and 1780, basically during the Revolutionary War. A hurricane in 1775 killed 4,000 people in Newfoundland Banks. A hurricane in 1776 killed 6,000 people in Guatemala, and a massive hurricane in the year 1780 killed 22,000 people. This was actually a very important event in the Revolutionary War, as it killed a large number of British sailors. As I said earlier, the DNC's attempt to erase large portions of American history is extremely unpatriotic, but it does follow Orwell's model of the Ministry of Truth, rewriting the past. Now let's examine Sigourney Weaver's claim that we didn't used to have big floods in the past.
This is not something we've seen before.
Well, actually, it is something we've seen before. In fact, all of the world's worst floods occurred a long time ago. In 1931, 1 to 4 million people died in China in a flood. In 1887, 900,000 to 2 million people died in a flood. In 1938, 500 to 800,000 people died in a flood in China. Note that 3 of the 5 deadliest floods on record occurred during the 1930s in China. Well, that was also the most extreme decade for weather in the United States, which included the worst heat waves, the worst droughts, and the most intense hurricane on U.S. history occurred in Florida in 1935. Here's an article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from August 24, 1931, about the massive flood in China. 2 million feared dead in China. Famine, pestilence pushing flood toll higher. Relief was rushed to the flooded Yangtze River Valley today, but with the knowledge that many more thousands will die before any measures can prove effective for the homeless, starving, and pestilence-ridden millions. At least 1,000 persons are dying each day. 60,000 square miles are covered by water 5 to 20 feet deep. 7 million people were homeless and destitute in those provinces. When Sigourney Weaver said that we've never seen anything like this before, she had it exactly backwards. You'd have to be at least 90 years old to remember any of the horrific events of the 1930s. What about floods in the United States? One of the worst ones occurred in 1913 in the Ohio River Valley. 1,000 lives lost, 200,000 people homeless, many dying from cold. The area bounded by Lake Erie, the Ohio River, the Indiana boundary, and the Pennsylvania boundary is suffering from floods. 200,000 people are homeless. Harrowing tales are percolating through of stricken people spending the night in trees and on housetops, falling into the water when exhausted from the cold and wet. Communication with Dayton has been completely cut off. This is what Dayton, Ohio looked like during the 1913 flood. Some pretty horrific scenes during and after the flood. One of the many freaks of the greatest flood in history, Dayton, Ohio, March 1913. And if the 1913 flood wasn't bad enough, it came just 4 days after one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history. This is a picture from Omaha, Nebraska 4 days earlier. The 1913 tornado outbreak spawned dozens of tornadoes which killed more than 400 people. And let's not forget something else that occurred in 1913. On July 10, 1913, California recorded the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth, 134 degrees. And before I proceed, let's do one more quick reminder of Sigourney Weaver's big lie, the DNC.
This is not something we've seen before.
America's worst flood occurred in 1927 along the Mississippi River. It lasted for 6 months. The 1927 Mississippi River flood was a big event in American history. Hundreds of thousands of homesteaders from Reconstruction after the Civil War were forced to leave their land, and they moved up to northern cities. This caused a fundamental change in the demographics of the United States. The 1927 flood inspired this song by Randy Newman.
What has happened down here is the wind has changed. Clouds roll in from the north and it starts to rain.
Later in 1927 came the worst flood in Vermont's history. Known as one of Vermont's most devastating events, the 1927 flood took out 1,285 bridges, miles and miles of roads and railroads, and countless homes and buildings. 84 people died in the flood, including Lieutenant Governor S. Hollister Jackson. I used to ride my bicycle right past this building every day in Winooski, Vermont on my way to work, so I have a good feel for just how big that flood was. Newspapers reported that nature was on a rampage in 1926 and 27. Main Street in Beardstown, Illinois at high tide, the town is still underwater, months later. Catastrophes, while not greatest in number, set record in magnitude and fury. What did Sigourney Weaver have to say about floods?
This is not something we've seen before.
In a sense, she was correct, because the floods from 90 years ago were much worse than anything we've seen today. The devastating floods of 1926 and 1927 came shortly after the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. On March 18, 1925, a series of devastating tornadoes struck the Midwest, which destroyed dozens of towns. The largest tornado was a mile wide. Tornadoes struck Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and they left 4,000 dead and injured. Hardest hit was Murfreesboro, Illinois, which was wiped off the map, as were many other towns. And another tornado in October 1927 destroyed much of St. Louis. The Red Cross declared 1927 to be the worst disaster year in their history after the previous record year of 1926. Mother Nature's disposition is getting nastier. The year 1926 was the worst disaster year in American history, according to the Red Cross. But the Mississippi flood soon gave the record for Mother Nature's wildest rampages to 1927. And the recent floods in New England have added the toil of another major disaster, only second in its proportions to that of the Valley states. Tornadoes and floods have killed more than 800 people and inflicted property damage estimated as high as $1 billion since January 1st.
This is not something we've seen before.
That's true, Sigourney. Unless you're 90 years old, you've never seen anything like this. Let's move on to the 1930s now, which was America's most extreme decade for weather. According to the EPA, the worst heat waves in U.S. history occurred during the 1930s. In fact, it wasn't even close. Check out these spikes in 1930, 1931, 1934, and 1936. Unprecedented heat in all four of those years. The 1936 heat wave was completely unlike anything Americans have seen since. It caused 12,183 deaths in the United States by July 25th of that year. During 1936, more than half of NOAA's thermometers in the United States reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare that to last year when about 9% reached 105 degrees. And remember, NOAA says that last year was the hottest year ever. The area of the U.S. affected by extremely hot weather has plummeted since the 1930s and another spike in the 1950s. And so has the frequency of hot days. During the 1930s, about one summer day out of four was over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and in 1936 it was more than one day out of three. During the 1950s it was more than one day out of five, but in recent years it's been closer to one day out of six, so the frequency of hot days has plummeted in the U.S. There were a lot of other extreme climate events going on in the 1930s too, like the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, which was the most intense hurricane in U.S. history. I'm shocked beyond words at the scenes of horror and destruction in the Florida Keys as a result of the storm. The whole scene down there is indescribable. At present, I do not know what the death toll is, but the Red Cross advises me its check shows about 446 persons known dead or missing. It's a frightful tragedy. And the same issue of the Chicago Tribune in 1935 reported that the glaciers of Alaska were rapidly disappearing. We could see that the huge Mendenhall Glacier is losing many miles of its front annually, Father Hubbard said. And the same was true for many other Alaskan glaciers. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane was so powerful, it actually blew a train 30 feet off the track. As much as 80% of the U.S. was in drought simultaneously during the 1930s, and on April 14, 1935, Black Sunday came, when a massive dust storm covered much of the Midwest. The heat and drought of the 1930s in the U.S. was so bad that 2.5 million climate refugees fled the Midwest and moved to California. Steinbeck wrote poignantly about this in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath.
This is not something we've seen before.
That's correct, Sigourney. Unless you're over 80 years old, you've never seen anything like this before. The most extreme year in modern U.S. history was 1936. I've already discussed the record heat of 1936, but a lot more was going on that year. The winter of 1936 was one of the coldest on record in the United States, and Niagara Falls froze solid. This was followed on St. Patrick's Day by one of the most extensive floods in U.S. history. All Eastern America under floodwaters. President signs appeal as capital flooded. 100 cities in 14 states affected. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was a massive dust storm raging in the West at the same time. Could you imagine if all this was going on now? Climate hysterics would be out of their minds. Pittsburgh was one of the hardest cities hit by the March 20th, 1936 floods. My grandfather was doing business in Pittsburgh that day and had to be rescued by boat from the downtown area. And 3 weeks after the massive floods of 1936 came one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history, which killed hundreds of people across the South.
This is not something we've seen before.
After the record cold, record floods, record dust storms, and record tornadoes of 1936 came the record heat. 1936 was the hottest summer on record in the United States. More than 12,000 Americans had already died from the heat by July 25th, and August was just as bad. This was the Weather Bureau temperature map from July 1936. It showed that the entire country was red hot, and this region around Nebraska and South Dakota was 12 degrees above normal. That's absolutely incredible. We've never seen anything like that since then.
This is not something we've seen before.
I could go on like this quite literally for days listing extreme weather events from the past, but I'm sure you've got the idea by now. Sigourney Weaver was lying. But it's not her fault. Sigourney Weaver is just a science fiction actress reading her lines. The real problem is the people behind this scam. They show pictures of scary extreme weather events, play scary music, and then tell us this has never happened before, which is just a blatant lie. We actually live in a period of extremely mild weather. We've had much more extreme weather in the past. The U.S. is currently experiencing the quietest decade on record for hurricanes and tornadoes. We don't have really bad floods like we had back in the 1920s and 1930s anymore. And heat waves have plummeted in the U.S. We just don't get extreme heat like that anymore.
Now, having said all this, why aren't I 50 points ahead, you might ask?
Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.